Hi, I am Dexter Palmer, and I'm going to be reading an excerpt from a work in progress that, if all goes well, will be published in early 2020. Been working on this novel for a few years, and this is the first time I've read any of this material publicly, so it's pretty exciting. But it's going to need some setting up. So the title of the novel is Mary Toft, or The Rabbit Queen, and there are a couple of different ways to answer the question of what it's about. The first, more literal answer is that it's based on a true story about a woman who lived in England in 1726 who hoaxed a great many people, including surgeons employed by King George himself, into believing that she had given birth to 17 rabbits. I know that raises more questions than it answers, like how or why, and I'm going to table all of those for now, except to let you know that in the course of researching this book, I have learned more about 18th century gynecology than I have ever hoped to know. So that's the literal answer. So another answer, though, that is less literal, but perhaps more accurate, is that it's about what I see as a certain tendency in humans towards self-deception, especially in an environment where expertise begins to become devalued. Most of us, even the smartest of us, prefer to have our beliefs confirmed by others rather than questioned or denied. There's a singular pleasure that is simple as a rush of dopamine when we open a newspaper or log onto social media or listen to someone standing behind a podium who confirms what we already know to be true or what we would like to believe is true. And in a culture where, for whatever reason, the words of experts aren't heeded, we can be led into believing the impossible, sometimes despite common sense or the evidence of our own two eyes. So another way to answer the question about what this book is about is that it's about that tendency toward self-deception, what causes it, and how we can stay vigilant against it, how we can determine that what we believe is in fact true, rather than what we would prefer to believe is true, because it makes us seem stronger in our own eyes, or safer, or wiser. Now, this is my first work of historical fiction after two previous books that are more on the speculative fiction side of things. One of my books is set in a fictional version of the 1950s, as people imagine they would be in 1900, and the other covers a time period from the 1990s to an unspecified near future, about 5 or 10 years from now. And one thing that's fortunate about this is that most of the skills that you pick up from writing speculative fiction carry over into writing historical fiction. In both instances, you're attempting to bring a world to life that neither writer nor reader has witnessed firsthand. Just as neither writer nor reader has seen the future, neither of them has firsthand knowledge of the distant past. The difference, however, is that historical fiction places a different set of constraints on you. If a vision of the future doesn't oblige your plotting or characterization or themes, then you simply change the details of that future. But many of the facts of the past are, for the large part, a settled matter. If it takes days rather than hours to travel 60 miles in a horse and carriage, then that travel has to be reflected in the narrative in some way. If you would like the home of one of your characters to be brightly lit, but that person doesn't have a lot of money, and you discover that candles are expensive and that taxes on a home were linked to the number of windows it had, then that home is just going to have to be dim. So, when I was writing early drafts of this novel, I thought that, because of its general concern with self-deception and self-delusion, It would be nice if I could have a character relate a story that I had this idea for, a variant of the old fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. But this is a place where the facts of history were, at first, unwilling to oblige me. For the novel is set in England in 1726, and the story we know as The Emperor's New Clothes was first published in Danish by Hans Christian Andersen in 1837. Without incorporating a time traveler who spoke Danish into the book, I wouldn't be able to pull this off. And though my other books might have had some room in there for a Danish time traveler, this one didn't. But I didn't really want to let the idea go, so I did some more research, and it turns out that, as some people in the audience may already know, Andersen didn't come up with that whole story out of his head. And fitting with the theme of this seminar, he had his own influences. Andersen's version of the tale is based on a story from a 14th century Spanish volume called The Book of Examples, which is a collection of cautionary fables, some of which derive from Aesop, some of which came from Persian folk tales from an earlier century still. Andersen didn't read them in Spanish, but he did have a German translation. So, as long as the story appeared somewhere in the world before 1726, I had something to work with. I'm a novelist, not a historian, so I have some room to just make things up. I can, for example, imagine a Spanish traveler making his way through England in the late 17th century who tells this story to a woman, who tells it to her daughter with some changes, and perhaps that daughter, with some more changes, relate it in turn to her son, who tells it in turn to my contemporary reader. So this variant version of the story that is an excerpt from the work in progress takes its title not from the Danish, but from the Spanish version. It's called The King and the Three Impostors. Okay. In a tiny kingdom whose name is lost to history, three impostors approached a king, presenting themselves as weavers with the rarest of talents. They claimed to be able to manufacture a cloth that was unparalleled in its beauty, exquisite in its design. Moreover, it had the ability to distinguish those men who were legitimate sons of their fathers from those who were bastards. To the bastard, the cloth would be invisible. Only a legitimate son would be able to see it and appreciate its magnificence. The king immediately saw the value of such a cloth, for the kingdom's laws declared that bastards could not inherit the property of their fathers, and in such instances, the property of the deceased would go to the state. He showered the impostors with silver and gold, assigned them a wing of rooms in his palace when they would not be disturbed, and set them to work. The impostors stayed in seclusion for 7 months, only dispatching occasional requests for servants to bring them sweetmeats and wine. Eventually, the king sent his Lord Chamberlain into their private wing to observe their progress. The impostors, become surprisingly corpulent and red-faced since anyone had last seen them, with ruptured veins coloring their noses, escorted the Lord Chamberlain into the chamber where they went about their labor. In the midst of disorder, plates with sauces dried to crust, half-full glasses of beer, discarded women's undergarments, was a loom, and on the loom, saw the Lord Chamberlain, was nothing. "Is it not wonderful?" said one of the impostors, gesturing at the empty loom. "So beautiful that one might be blinded by it, were one to look upon it for too long. You must take care, avert your eyes if you begin to feel faint." Of course, the Lord Chamberlain began to recall a few moments in his youth when he had spied his mother closeted in conversation with one of the family's gardeners, and she had protested, perhaps a touch too vehemently, that she was doing nothing wrong, and that what he saw was best forgotten. "It is wonderful," said the Lord Chamberlain, so stunning that I can barely believe my eyes. You notice the intricate weaving together of spun gold and silver threads? The impostor lifted nothing in his hands and held it toward the Lord Chamberlain. Supple and smooth to the touch, yet it would turn away an assassin's dagger thrust. Do you wish to feel it? The Lord Chamberlain retreated. To touch such fabric is a privilege I did not deserve. It must be reserved for the king. I am content merely to look. I am quite satisfied that the work is progressing apace. I leave you to your labors. The trio of impostors sent him on his way with a long, rumbling belch in three-part harmony. The impostors worked on the fabric for another year, and eventually the king became impatient. Rousing himself from his throne, he entered their private rooms and found them in the chamber where they labored. To his surprise, he found that a year of endless meats and pastries had enlarged them astonishingly, making them tiny-eyed and triple-chinned. Moreover, they were completely naked and stood before him without shame, innocent as Adam. Before the king could declare his shock, anger, and disgust, one of the impostors approached him, head bowed, flesh quivering, and with a tremulous voice he made a confession that as their bodies had grown and their original clothing no longer fit, they had used the special fabric to make 3 suits for themselves. We realize that only a king deserves to clothe himself in such splendor, the impostor said, as behind him, the other 2 turned in circles with their arms raised, modeling nothing but their own folds of fat. I hope to restrain your justifiable anger with the news that we have, just today, completed a 4th suit of this material for yourself. Your native resplendence will only serve to amplify the beauty of the fabric, casting the 3 of us in shadow. It was impossible to even consider the possibility that the 3 impostors would be so bold as to exhibit themselves naked before the king and tell a flagrant lie. Such impertinence defied belief. And so the king knew, or thought he knew, 2 things: that the fabric functioned as the impostors had advertised, and that he himself was a bastard, unaware of this until now. As for the latter fact, no one else needed to know. In fact, the knowledge had to be kept secret, lest a pretender to the throne appear and the nation plunge into war. As for the former, well, it was high time for all the other bastards to unwittingly reveal themselves, so that their so-called parents would fill the king's coffers. Praising the impostors' workmanship and thanking them profusely, the king ordered the suit they had made for him to be boxed and brought to his living quarters, and commanded that a day in the following week would be set aside for a grand procession at whose head he would appear. No one would work that day, and attendance would be mandatory. He would wear the miraculous suit, display it to the populace, and in the reactions to his wardrobe, he would see what he would see. On the day of the grand procession, a tradesman, whose name is also lost to history, closed his shop as the royal edict commanded and took his young son to view the parade. They were among the first to arrive along the route, and they staked out a spot at the side of the road where they could have a clear view. The tradesman's loves could be counted on one hand, but they were simple and pure. He loved his family, and he loved his nation. If pressed, it would be difficult for him to say which he loved more. Family provided benefits that were immediate and constant, real and easy to cherish. The warmth of your wife's embrace, the merry laughter of your daughters, or the way in which your only son looked up at you with a mother's inherited eyes. But family, wonderful as it could be, was precarious and ephemeral in the great scheme of things. A human life was but a moment measured against the life of a nation. No one knew when death might steal one's wife or son or daughter away, but a nation's love for its citizens would last forever. The nation had existed long before the tradesman had been born, and it would remain long afterward to safeguard the livelihoods of his descendants after he himself had passed. To have a wife look into your eyes provided a small, daily, dependable reassurance that you were loved and that you deserved love. But what would that be compared to falling, even briefly, under the kind scrutiny of a king who embodied the nation that granted succor to so many? Even a short glance would serve to affirm a man's sureness of his worth for decades. And to meet the king's eyes as a boy would allow the boy to see what he himself might become and might set him on the path to become the greatest of men. Such was the thinking of the tradesman who pulled his sleepy-eyed son out of his bed at sunrise to wait for the king's appearance. He thought it best to let his daughters sleep. As noon approached, the crowd became larger and larger still, the susurration of the thousands and garrulous conversation behind them becoming louder and louder. The sun was high in a cloudless sky. The weather was perfect, with a slight cooling wind to counteract the heat of bodies pressed together. The tradesman and his son were at the very front of the throng. They would not have to crane their necks or bob their heads to see the king as he passed, clothed in what was rumored to be the most fantastic royal robe that man had ever laid eyes on in all of human history. The robe had become the foremost topic of conversation among all the nation's citizens. They spent sleepless nights attempting to imagine that which was beyond imagining. At noon sharp, the tradesman heard a cheer in the distance, the roar rising in volume as it came closer, and he looked down the road to see the royal procession approaching, lines of soldiers marching in spirited step, their legs kicking high, flautists and trumpeters and drummers playing the national anthem, flags and pennants flapping. The tradesman's heart began to hurl itself against his rib cage, as if it wanted to burst free of his chest and flop down on the road before him, offering itself up to be trampled. At the front of the procession was the king himself, standing proud in the rear of a wagon towed by 6 white horses, arms akimbo, grinning with his chin jutted forward and his head held high. And as the tradesman looked on the king, he squinted as if blinded, not quite trusting his eyes. And then he saw the robe. He saw it, and he freely wept. It shimmered, it shone, it altered. Sometimes it appeared as the colors of the national flag in sumptuous shades of crimson, ivory, and ultramarine. Sometimes it appeared as if the king had shrouded himself in 1,000 ribbons made of rainbows. The sheer magnificence of the king's clothing threatened to bring the tradesman to faintness, but with a strength of will, the cheers of the crowd around him resounding in his ears, he managed to stay upright, keep his head, and direct his son to look. The young boy's eyes widened as his mouth dropped open, and he first began to chuckle, then to laugh without restraint, his high-pitched ha, ha, ha cutting through the applause. The tradesman became confused. Was laughter the expression of the child's awe? "Do you see it?" he asked. "Isn't it wonderful?" The boy laughed harder still and pointed. "He's naked," he shouted. "The king is naked." And at that, the wagon with its 6 white horses slowed, then stopped, as the cheering of the crowd began to be shot through with murmurs of consternation. Puzzled, the tradesman looked up at the king, and to his alarm, he found that the king was staring directly back at him with a cruel, confident half-smile. And worse, he was in fact as naked as he'd been on the day of his birth, his body drooping, sagging, pasty, riddled with spots and scars. and yet he seemed unembarrassed. Yet the smile remained on his face with its knowing twist, as if the king was waiting for the tradesman to realize something and to take a necessary course of action. The king seemed strangely unworried that the crowd behind the tradesmen was becoming enraged, the clamor of their shouts developing a nasty edge. It was only the child who was consumed by gay, mocking laughter, and as the tradesman felt a hand grasp his shoulder from behind, perhaps in threat, perhaps in reassurance, he looked up into the naked king's eyes, and he knew what he had to do. Standing behind his son, he bent over him, and he whispered a brief, heartfelt apology in his ear. Then, with an ease surprising even to himself, he snapped the child's neck. The boy's head fell sideways as the light went out in his eyes, and he collapsed to the ground like a marionette cut loose from its strings, a last laugh dying in his throat. The tradesman looked up at the king again, and the monarch smiled down at the tradesman with pleasure, and the robe the king wore had become, somehow, even more dazzling. Its fabric had manifested as a rippling mirror, which reflected the tradesman back to himself as what he imagined to be, as what he imagined himself to be, and as he once was, and as he would become. For a brief moment, the tradesman had experienced what one might call a vision, some sort of devilish illusion, the details of the matter too embarrassing to repeat. But that cursed vision was gone now, and the hurrahs of the crowd grew ever louder and more frenzied as the team of horses pulled the king's wagon onward. The tradesman loved his nation, and in the king's beatific gaze, he felt that love affirmed and justified. He had only one regret, that he did not have a son with whom to share this day, for such a sight was the kind of experience that might set a boy on the path to a fruitful manhood, all in a moment. But alas, the tradesman's wife had only ever given birth to daughters. Thank you.